Hello, I'm Sarah Rimington, Area Manager at Discover the World Education, and I'm delighted to be running this webinar this afternoon. A little bit about me before we start. I've worked in the travel industry for over 10 years after studying travel and tourism at university, after which I became a lecturer in travel and tourism management for just over 7 years. I taught a little bit of BTEC initially before going on to teach on undergraduate courses, for which I was final year course team leader. I've worked at Discover the World now for almost 5 years. This presentation is actually a section of a CPD session I've produced to deliver in person. But given the current circumstances, it's lovely to be able to deliver this online. But I'll give you a little bit more information on that towards the end. So today I'm going to be discussing the role of perceptions in sustainable tourism management in rural Iceland. I'll begin by looking at the growth of tourism over the last decade before exploring the importance of nature tourism and tourist interaction with Icelandic nature. I'll then look at the concept of over-tourism in relation to Iceland and whether this is a fair assessment. To understand this further, I'll use the Purism scale and tourism area life cycle model as frameworks to explore tourist behaviour and tourism carrying capacity, drawing on some research from the University of Iceland. Lastly, I'll introduce the Katla UNESCO Geopark as a case study. So to begin, let's look at the growth of tourism in Iceland. This graph shows the significant growth of tourism in Iceland since 2010. This growth is down to a variety of reasons. This includes the 2008 economic crash and subsequent drop in the value of the Icelandic krona, the global exposure resulting from the 2010 Eyjafjallajökull eruption, an increase in flight seats, and also the rise of Iceland as a stopover destination, as well as exposure from a number of high-profile TV programs, films, music videos, and other media. This graph shows that a record 2.3 million visitors were seen in 2018 after considerable year-on-year growth. However, the year-on-year percentage growth has been coming down since 2016, when we saw a huge 40% year-on-year increase. 2019 saw the first negative growth figures in Iceland due to a variety of reasons. As tourism boomed, prices in Iceland had begun to rise. Availability of accommodation became more limited, making a once affordable holiday destination increasingly expensive. Tourists from the UK, one of Iceland's main markets, increasingly have found Iceland more expensive. And post-Brexit, numbers began to drop. The strong krona, rising labour costs, collapse of WOW Air, and the Boeing 737 MAX groundings have all contributed to the downturn. However, this is far from a collapse in Iceland's tourism industry, bearing in mind that the lower tourist numbers in 2019 still equates to more than a 250% increase since 2011. And prices in Iceland have become lower again. For now, as in all over the world, tourism in Iceland is at a complete standstill. This first graph shows the top nationalities of the international visitors to Iceland, showing the biggest increase in visitors over the last 5 years has been from the US, with a significant fall last year, with the collapse of WOW Air making travel more difficult and expensive, although the strong krona was already deterring some US visitors. The reason I've included this second graph, showing the change in visitors in 2018 and 2019, is that it shows that whilst most nationalities showed a levelling off or a drop, before we entered the current situation and the global grounding of flights, visitors from China were actually increasing, and the first direct flights from China had recently been announced. Chinese visitors also spend more than any other visitors. This graph shows the increasing importance of tourism to the Icelandic economy over the last decade. In 2015, tourism overtook the other two main industries, seafood and aluminium, to become the biggest export. But it's actually not that long ago that tourism was not considered important economically. In 1993, the director of the Icelandic Tourist Board wrote a piece titled "Foreign Currency by Each Tourist the Same as 1 Ton of Cod." In the article, he connected tourism to something people understood: fish. He referred to tourists as tourist stock, Iceland airplanes as trawlers, and argued the stock would enable increased fisheries in the future. By using the vocabulary of fishery management and arguing that each tourist was similar value to 1 ton of cod, for the first time, tourism slowly began to make its way into the national economic discussions. Here, we see the increase in employment in the tourism industry over the last decade. The wavy line showing the seasonal nature of tourism work. Although seasonality has been falling in recent years in Iceland as the winter months become more popular with tourists. So, what are the key drivers for tourists visiting Iceland as a destination? There's a lot to take in here, but research by the Icelandic Tourist Board showed that over 90% of visitors highlighted Icelandic nature as a primary reason for wanting to visit. Within this, they mention the Northern Lights, the unspoilt natural nature, glaciers, waterfalls, lagoons. In addition, more than 70% of those surveyed mentioned nature-related activities, and just under 40% said films and TV highlighting the Icelandic landscapes were a key motivator. So the appeal of Icelandic nature and landscapes for tourists can't be underestimated. In this further research, it's the uniqueness and perceived unspoilt nature of Iceland's landscape that is clearly appealing to tourists, with words such as untouched, unaffected, stillness, and wilderness scoring highly in tourist perception of the destination. The appeal of wilderness is certainly used in tourism promotion, and is the imagery we see in relation to Iceland in many tourism brochures and on social media. Tourists are attracted to what is often considered to be Europe's last wilderness. However, touristic wilderness and its image of pristine and empty nature can be problematic, and in many ways, and not only in Iceland. In terms of managing tourist expectations, conflicts for people making a living in wilderness areas, and energy infrastructure development, for example. Of course, the promotion of this touristic wilderness can also have positive impacts and be a powerful tool for conservation. But there's a massive tangent I could disappear off into here, and I won't. In fact, only around 30% of Iceland is considered to be wilderness by definition, shown here by the blue shaded area. Of this, around 60% is in the highlands and a third covered by glaciers. And the number of tourists that actually reach these wilderness areas is far smaller, around 30% in the summer months, with road accessibility meaning this is a summer destination. This next diagram doesn't actually show this as much as it could. However, it does highlight the regional disparity of tourism in Iceland, with the majority of tourists visiting the Reykjavik area and possibly adding a Golden Circle trip or a trip to the south coast. In fact, the number of tourists venturing outside of Reykjavik and surrounding areas outside of the summer months is even lower. If we consider that the only international airport in Iceland, Keflavik Airport, is in the southwest, a 40-minute drive from the capital city of Reykjavik, the regional disparity of visitors is really no surprise. A number of smaller regional airports and the Route 1 highway connect visitors with the rest of the country, but a large majority of visitors decide to stay close to the main international access point. So we've seen the appeal of Icelandic nature and its importance to the tourism industry. So let's explore that a little further. Firstly, what exactly is nature tourism? Nature-based tourism includes activities in natural areas outside of the person's usual surroundings. Therefore, it's a coming together of activities, tourism, and natural resources. The nature tourism experience is a collection of tangible and intangible elements, and natural resources are fundamental in several ways, whether that be as a site, the landscape, as an area for an activity, or as a pull factor or an attraction in its own right. Therefore, the quality and protection of natural resources are fundamental to the successful nature tourism, which is why nature tourism all around the world is often in conflict with other extractive operations, for example, forestry, farming, mining, or in Iceland with renewable energy developments. So, how do we experience nature as tourists? Has it changed, and does it really matter? In an article on how we experience nature, Lund highlights that people appreciate and experience nature in different ways. It's individual to each one of us, and this will influence how we travel through it, how we perceive it, and ultimately how it needs to be managed. Our individual experience of nature are linked to our backgrounds, our experiences, our knowledge, and our assumptions and expectations prior to travel. So when we travel and engage with nature, she says we will always be caught up in the entanglement of our own world, which makes tourism management and understanding tourists all the more complicated. Certainly in the case of tourists in Iceland, they tend to perceive areas to be more natural and quieter than residents due to their different backgrounds. Mobile technology and social media have certainly changed how we travel and how we experience what we seek out. We are bombarded with imagery every day, and we are influenced by it. The National Geographic produced an interesting article about how travel is now often a curated experience, an unnatural approach to travel. Seeking out the sites we have seen online and capturing and sharing those images. Is travel therefore more staged these days? For many, is capturing the right image more important than the actual natural experience? These photos here, taken in the Norwegian fjords, demonstrate how imagery can lie. And this is the case in many more places. We are drawn to the destination by the image of a person alone in stunning scenery and solitude. However, the same photo, taken from another angle, shows the reality with cues to get that same photo of sublime empty nature. Maybe you've experienced this elsewhere yourself, where the wilderness image doesn't quite match up to the reality. This quest for the perfect photo certainly causes problems in Iceland, and we see many examples of foolish, dangerous, and environmentally damaging behaviour, whether it's trampling fragile vegetation, hanging off the edge of cliffs or waterfalls, risking the unforgiving waves, or lying in the middle of an apparent empty road. So much so that the Iceland Tourist Board felt the need to produce a video of how to catch a safe selfie for tourists. According to convention, nature in its purest form is considered to be somewhere where there is no culture. Therefore, nature tourism in Iceland is often separated from cultural tourism. However, is it really possible to separate nature and culture? In Iceland, as in many other countries, nature and landscape impact on a resident's sense of identity. And in terms of tourism management, this is important to consider because the residents' connection with a place will affect their attitude towards change in the landscape and ultimately tourism development. In Iceland, there are strong connections between national identity and the landscape, both in terms of special places such as Thingvellir, but also in terms of the Icelandic sagas and folklore history and the stories still told today. But research also shows that tourists, and in particular regular visitors, can also have strong connections to places. And the stronger these connections, the more perceptive and critical they are of tourism impacts or perceived tourism impacts. Therefore, higher place attachment will equal greater environmental concern. I thought this quote describing the author's sense of connection with the Icelandic landscape, in particular, she's talking about the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, describes this connection beautifully. The sight of the glacier at the edge of a horizon on a clear day can be a source for much delight. At these moments, I sense a deep personal connection with the mountain, and my body and mind are absorbed by the view. When I asked a friend to describe how she connects to the glacier, she told me how it plays music for her when she looks at it from her kitchen window. So, given the importance of nature to the Icelandic people and the tourism industry, there is obviously a need to protect that finite natural resource. I'm sure many of you will have seen or read articles talking about Iceland suffering from over-tourism. Perhaps you've considered whether or not you want to still visit a country described as such. Perhaps you feel from your own visits that Iceland is suffering from too much tourism. Perhaps you still want to visit, but would prefer to move away from some of the honeypot sites. The considerable growth in tourism over the last few years has certainly had its challenges for Iceland. Perhaps now we've hit the pause button, it gives time to reflect and consider tourism moving forward. I've certainly seen evidence of this in other destinations in the last few days. Negative publicity, founded or unfounded, will inevitably impact people's perception of the destination and its appeal. Tourism impacts arise as both actual and perceived changes to the environment. So is it quite as straightforward as the headlines suggest? Research from the Icelandic Tourist Board showed that 44% of those surveyed agreed with the statement, Iceland has too many tourists. A worrying figure, particularly when you see that just under 80% of those who responded to the survey had never actually been to Iceland. The negative media stories may therefore be influencing people and could influence their travel choices in the future. So, if we consider one of the most well-known tourism models, Butler's tourism area life cycle model, where do you consider Iceland currently stands? The TALC model considers the relationship between the number of tourists and the evolution of the tourist destination over time. Each stage entails a change in regards to the number of visitors, but also the tourist behaviour and relationship with the host communities. A criticism of the model is that it is used to look back and explain development rather than a model used to predict and for proactive tourism management. We'll come back to this model a little bit later, but I think it's important when we consider whether Iceland has indeed become a victim of over-tourism that we look at the following graph. This was 2016, so there will have been some movement since then, but it shows how relatively small the tourism industry in Iceland is compared to other destinations. Iceland in blue on the end is below Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Georgia, and others. So whilst the growth of tourism has certainly been fast, it's still a minnow in a global context. If we compare annual visitors to Iceland to some of the UK's national parks, it does enable us to consider the over-tourism label more critically. Whilst there is no doubt that the growth in tourism in Iceland has been considerable and brought with it challenges given the speed of growth and need for infrastructure, legislation and management to catch up, This table shows that total visitors at the peak in 2018 were just a fraction of the visitors to the most popular national parks in the UK. Almost 20 million visitors to the Lake District, an area loved for its natural beauty, compared to just over 2 million in the whole of Iceland. Having been brought up in Wales and now living in Yorkshire, the North Yorkshire Moors and Brecon Beacons are not areas I would associate with over-tourism, although they can, of course, be busy at hotspots on a sunny day. So has Iceland met or overshot its tourism carrying capacity, as some media and visitors may believe, when it has half or a quarter of the number of visitors as these national parks, and over a much larger area? Or has it got further capacity for growth, given the numbers shown here? Of course, there will be tourists and residents that would prefer the Iceland of 10 years ago. However, tourism has grown, and particularly in the south, there are many more tourists today. However, there are still areas of Iceland largely untouched by tourism. When I travelled in the north and east in the main Easter holidays a couple of years ago, we had many of the natural sites to ourselves. In this presentation, we will consider the concept of carrying capacity, but I don't think it's something that can be analysed at a destination level. We'll look at nature tourism in rural Iceland in particular, and whether it's sustainable. Icelandic ecosystems are particularly fragile due to the short growing season, cold climate, and rich volcanic activities. The moss heath is particularly vulnerable. Pictures like these of tourists and celebrities alike damaging this fragile nature cannot be ignored. Whether it's Justin Bieber rolling on precious moss, some YouTuber off-roading and getting stuck, tourists ignoring no trampling signs to recreate the perfect picture, or yes, quite unbelievably, using nature as an alfresco toilet. Spatial planning and well-managed tourism is absolutely vital in rural Iceland, and understanding tourists, their relationship with nature, their perceptions and behaviours is fundamental. One tool to help us understand tourists, their perceptions and behaviours in a natural setting is the Purism scale. Many variables influence an individual's perception and satisfaction when visiting natural areas, including the level of infrastructure and services, the density of tourists, background, interests, expectations, assumptions, and needs. This makes it really difficult to simply estimate a carrying capacity for a site and the tolerance for anthropogenic impacts on the environment. Some tourists are not sensitive to man-made changes, while others, it will ruin their experience. The Purism scale groups together people with similar attitude to these changes into 4 groups: strong purists, moderate purists, neutralists, and non-purists. At one extreme, the strong purists prefer primitive facilities in an unspoilt, remote natural environment. At the other end of the scale, non-purists or urbanists are attracted by a variety of facilities and services. They're not put off by human-induced changes to the environment and are not sensitive to the number of tourists at the site. Shown in its simplest form, and apologies for any oversimplification, a strong purist discovers an area, attracted by its pristine environment. They're the explorers, according to Butler's model. They prefer primitive facilities, they appreciate solitude and dislike restrictions being placed on them. Their stays in an area are longer and the journey is part of the experience. Through word of mouth, the popularity of the site increases, attracting more strong purists. And as the appeal of the destination becomes greater, word of mouth and the popularity of the site attracts moderate purists. Accessibility may be improved slightly and numbers begin to grow, but the visitors are still attracted by the pristine environment. Strong purists may begin to leave the area now, put off by what they perceive as too many tourists. And the increasing popularity sees the arrival of the neutralists, which in turn creates demand for some tourism infrastructure. But they also are still attracted to the area for the perceived pristine nature. As a consequence of increasing numbers of visitors and growing infrastructure, the area becomes less attractive to the moderate purists. Their perception is the area is becoming overcrowded and the beauty of the nature being spoilt. It's important to highlight that the neutralists who have a higher tolerance for human changes will not perceive the area as crowded or spoilt. The increasing infrastructure attracts more neutralists, which further increases the demand for facilities and infrastructure. This expansion of infrastructure has a positive impact on the popularity of the site, and we see a higher number of tourists. This is when the non-purist visitors arrive, or the urbanists. Increased accessibility and more services will further increase the number of non-purists who stay less time and behave and experience nature in a different way. With increasing numbers of visitors and growing infrastructure, the visual appearance of the landscape has changed, as has the visitor experience and their behaviour. The non-purists are attracted to the site now more for its reputation, the accessibility, and the range of services on offer than its original natural attractiveness. Neutralists feel the area is now overcrowded and they will begin to be turned off visiting. And so you're just left with the non-purist visitors. They will not perceive the area to be crowded and will see the infrastructure as a positive. The popularity of the site will continue to grow until environmental impacts mean it can no longer be sustained. It's important to highlight at this stage, it's difficult to turn back in terms of attracting other visitors. The environmental impact is both from the increase in tourism, but also the increased infrastructure. The big danger here is the site becoming unattractive even to the non-purists. So where do you think you sit on the Purism scale? What's your tolerance for other visitors and tourism infrastructure? So if we provide a summary here, the Purism scale demonstrates that an increase in infrastructure leads to a change appearance of the natural setting, which leads to a change in the tourist experience and a change in their behaviour. Ultimately, left unchecked, the increased man-made changes and numbers of visitors can lead to increased environmental pressure. And as we discussed earlier, there could be increased concern from those visitors and residents who have strong connections to the area. If a purist continues to visit an area that has considerable change in appearance in the visitor type and the visitor number, they may show concern for the area and may consider it spoilt. And yet other tourists may still view it as idyllic and unspoilt and be more than satisfied. It all depends on our perception of nature and tolerance for anthropogenic changes. The changes to the natural site are most significant when we move from neutralist to non-purist. However, it's the arrival of the neutralists and their initial push for infrastructure that starts the chain of events. It's often at this stage that you find you have conflict between different stakeholders. And it's vital that all the stakeholders, including local communities, are listened to understand the desired future direction of tourism at the site. No strategy risks travelling towards the point of no return. And there is a danger that you have a build-up of small infrastructure developments over time that go almost undetected. For example, signs, fences, paths, car parks, and they gradually change the visual appearance of the site, driving out other visitors until only the urbanists remain. Research has shown that there is a clear correlation between improved accessibility and tourist behaviour. Improved accessibility leads to higher tourist numbers, perceived crowding, shorter length of stay, and demand for more infrastructure. Journey time is a more decisive factor than the actual physical distance, and so the paving of roads can have a significant impact on visitor numbers. As well as the increase in tourists, the impact of the road improvements on surrounding ecosystems must also be considered. In response to the rapid growth of tourism in Iceland, a large number of roads have been approved to remote natural destinations. However, this research highlights the importance of careful consideration before implementing any such road improvements, as it starts a chain of complex processes that are usually impossible to reverse. Therefore, accessibility is a critical factor in the future development of tourism in Iceland. The researchers question the national strategy to try and distribute tourists more evenly around the island. They argue there is a need to assess whether road improvements will actually relieve pressure on other popular sites. And if it is shown that it wouldn't, they question whether other areas should actually be protected from development. However, there are many areas in Iceland where residents are calling out for more visitors. Here, Butler's TALC model has been adapted utilising the Purism scale to better analyse and understand the transition from one stage of evolution to another at a natural site. It's important to fully understand the forces and triggers which cause transition from one stage to another, and the Purism scale can help us do this. The stagnation and then decline of each stage indicates that the carrying capacity for that particular type of tourist has been met or overshot. Therefore, it's vital that any tourism strategy understands fully what type of tourists you want to attract and what is their ceiling in terms of man-made changes and perceived crowding. It's important to plan proactively and not reactively, or in hindsight, in order to avoid transition to an unwanted stage. The carrying capacity, therefore, in this case, doesn't mean the maximum number of tourists a site can hold, as traditionally considered, but the optimum level of infrastructure and services for your desired tourist type. The TALC model, therefore, could be viewed as a number of cycles, with each cycle entailing changes in regards to the number and type of visitor and the evolution and transformation of the tourist site. In the first cycle, the area is explored by the purists. In the second cycle, it's explored by the moderate purists, and so on. Unsurprisingly, considering the increasing tourism numbers, research shows that the diversity of tourists in Iceland today is far greater than 20 years ago. Research carried out in 2016 at 5 different natural sites across Iceland, with different levels of accessibility and popularity, showed around half of visitors were neutralists. The second largest group at all sites was urbanists, followed by purists. And the percentage of purists was slightly higher at the more remote locations. However, the difference between each site was actually not strikingly different. Interestingly, alternative research into Icelandic tourists alone found just over 50% were urbanists, less than 40% neutralists, and 8% moderates, with just a few strong purists. They were found to appreciate solitude and tranquility, but they did tolerate infrastructure for outdoor recreation, for example, preferring to have well-maintained trails, signposting, picnic areas, and campsites. However, they see things such as hotels, shops, and service stations as a negative in the wilderness areas. In the Highlands, Iceland's wilderness area, research carried out in 2014 showed that a quarter of visitors were purists, half were neutralists, and the other quarter urbanists. Despite some concerns from tourists regarding changes and tourist numbers in 3 of the most popular locations, overall 96 to 99% of tourists felt the area they visited offered unspoilt wilderness. In one of the most popular of the sites in the research, purists had been displaced by neutralists and urbanists, who in their eyes still experienced wilderness, despite the number of tourists. The purists visited more remote locations which satisfied their personal needs. These maps show tourist experience of wilderness in the Southern Highlands, which is the most accessible and highly visited area in this region. This research shows that urbanists experience pretty much the whole of the lowlands area as wilderness, while strong purists perceive less than half of the area to be wilderness, predominantly the glacier-covered areas. Growing emphasis on protecting Iceland's wilderness is highlighted in various current policies, as well as the preparation of a new Highland National Park, which will cover approximately 1/3 of Iceland's land surface. However, the Icelandic National Planning Strategy 2015 to 2026 highlights the importance of protecting wilderness whilst also promoting the development of proper tourism infrastructure, which we understand can be conflicting. It's therefore vital that a framework such as the Purism scale is used to carefully plan any such developments to avoid moving to a type of tourism not desired in a particular area. So how can all of this, perceptions, assumptions, expectations, actually inform sustainable tourism management in practice? The Katla UNESCO Geopark is an example of how this theory can underpin a sustainable tourism development plan for the future. The geopark includes some of Iceland's most popular tourist sites, including the coastal town of Vík and the surrounding beaches, the popular waterfalls including Skogafoss and Seljalandsfoss, Solheimeyjokul Glacier, and more remote areas like Forsmark. So it has glaciers, volcanoes, mountains, beaches, rivers, waterfalls, lava fields, and beautiful, beautiful scenery. There's so much to attract visitors, and the area is incredibly popular with our school groups. But it is also a fragile environment that we need to protect. The geopark is named after the famous Katla volcano, which is situated within the park. It has a total area of just over 9,500 square kilometres and a population of approximately 2,700. The park has 59 sites of geological interest, as well as 22 sites of cultural interest. Traditionally, the main economic activity in the park has been agriculture. However, this has been facing gradual decline and subsequent unemployment. As with many rural areas, this has led to outmigration from the area, particularly of the young. Many residents believe tourism can help boost the local economy and improve the area in the long term. However, there are some concerns over the impacts of the fast growth in tourism. The many sites attractive to tourists are situated in ecologically sensitive landscapes, and in places the landscape is suffering from tourism activity, particularly the vulnerable moss-covered lava fields. In places, the fragile moss has turned into brown mud, and tourist trails are only marked out by rope and small signs. In other areas, for instance, around some of the popular waterfalls, paths often turn to mud trails, particularly after heavy rain. 51 different geosites are currently promoted to tourists spread across a vast area, and this makes it almost impossible to manage and control all the different sites. Current tourism infrastructure is often inadequate, incomplete, or unsuitable for the growing number of visitors. Despite most sites having designated access points or car parks, many tourists just park on or just off the road to walk directly onto the landscape from wherever they want. Often there are no barriers in place to stop tourists doing this, making it difficult to manage the fragile landscape and also ensure safety on the roads. However, constructing lots of barriers and fences would also not be the answer, as that would also have a negative impact. At many of the popular sites, the service level and facilities need improvement, including better signage and information boards, presence of rangers, information centres to educate tourists, and sufficient toilet facilities. In many cases, facilities such as signs, bins, toilets, picnic areas have been built in the area with no consideration of their design or placement in the setting. Often, the ad hoc placement of the facilities, due to the abundance of space and lack of coordination, has a negative impact on the visitor's experience and the beauty of the attraction. For example, at Seljalandsfoss or Skogafoss, all kinds of structures and signs impact on a tourist's first views of the beauty spots. Also, often the sudden urgency to repair and restore damaged sites leads to quick fix responses that are often not site specific. Another challenge is the safety of the tourists within the landscape. Many people are ignoring the signs and fences put there to protect them from hazards, resulting in even more signs and fences being put in place. And whilst tourism is seen as a vital source of jobs and income for local communities, in some places there is some concern about the cohesion of the local community. Tourism is bringing more non-Icelandic employees into the area, and whilst this is by no means seen as a bad thing, ways to involve the new inhabitants in the community are important. In order to come up with a destination management plan, 3 workshops were held with a wide range of stakeholders, including planning representatives, local communities, tourism businesses, residents, landowners, national park representatives, but also landscape architects and university professors. And as part of the workshops, they visited all the destinations currently visited by and promoted to tourists. After those visits, they zoned the geopark in terms of the current tourist situation. The red area showing those developed areas, accessible and marketed to all tourists. The green areas showed the primitive and semi-primitive areas, which would appeal more to the purists due to the accessibility. The next slide shows their desired plan for the geopark, and you'll see there's quite significant changes. With a much more limited area along the main Route 1 highway, accessible and promoted to urbanist tourists, leaving the remainder of the park less accessible and more appealing to other types of tourists seeking out a wilderness experience. The plan then structures the geopark with different experiences to appeal to the different target groups. The main focal points are likely to be visited by the majority of tourists. They have excellent accessibility, multiple facilities, and are actively promoted. The target group here are the urbanists. Alongside this, you have secondary sites, which require better protection. They're not suitable for mass tourism. They're less accessible, maybe have unpaved roads or require hiking to get to. They'll have little to no facilities and are less actively promoted. The target group here are neutralists. All other sites, they suggest, currently visited by tourists should be fully excluded from tourism infrastructure. They would have limited accessibility, no facilities at all, and will not be promoted at all. If they're currently promoted, they would be demarketed. The target group here are purists, those looking for a more wilderness experience. Additional tourist infrastructure and services, they say, should be concentrated in the main towns to increase facilities and services for the local communities and provide jobs and try and discourage people from moving out of the rural towns. But this will also try to avoid damaging the landscape out of the towns and leave the beauty spots untouched. In this way, tourism provides opportunities for sustainable rural developments. This structuring of the park and hierarchy of sites raises the question whether tourists should be equally distributed over the landscape, as discussed earlier, or whether it is better to strategically concentrate people and traffic. This plan suggests that offering and marketing innumerable sites is likely to cause uncontrollable and widespread damage to the landscape. Limiting the number of sites and creating a hierarchy, they believe, helps them regain control. In some cases, this plan suggests closing access to current tourist sites, which they consider unsuitable for current levels of visitation. For example, they suggest closing the road to the top of the popular coastal site Deeralay and making it accessible only by a hiking trail, and more suitable lower viewing point being accessible to all. The plan also advises against current plans for improved accessibility at other sites that they don't feel should be opened up to increased visitation, for example at Forsmark. Some sites, while still vitally important in terms of the geopark, will no longer be part of the tourism infrastructure at all. As with any plan with so many stakeholders, implementation has many challenges. Icelandic land ownership legislation means that owners of small pieces of land can have a large influence and block projects. Complicated land ownership can therefore cause difficulties. A different area, but the popular tourist site of Giza, for example, is privately owned by a small consortium, yet the adjacent land with the shop, cafe facilities and car park is state-owned, so this can present challenges. The plan suggests the closure or devaluation of some sites, and this obviously may not be popular with all stakeholders concerned. Considerable financial and human investment is needed to fulfill the plan. Where is this going to come from, and what pressure will this put on local communities? Projects and interventions will need to be prioritised. It can't all be done at once. The most urgent sites under the most pressure need to be prioritised. Who is responsible ultimately for the implementation when there are so many stakeholders involved in a plan such as this? And importantly, where does this plan sit with the current national tourism strategy? There are clear contradictions in terms of sharing out tourists across more sites and the fundamental principle of streamlining tourism in this plan. However, the plan suggests that by focusing on the quality of the tourist experience, it is possible to ensure that the current consumption of landscape by tourists is replaced by sustainable experiences. And this will require a holistic approach with marketing and promotion and spatial planning and design. So what does this plan actually suggest for key sites in the geopark, and how do the solutions that they offer differ from other strategies for the same sites? Well, this is something we consider and discuss in my full CPD session. The case study offers fantastic opportunities for students to debate current issues being faced, different possible solutions, and offers some great decision-making exercises for sustainable tourism management. But we don't have time to cover everything today. Have a look on our website for details of this and other free CPD sessions that we currently offer, and once we're all able to see one another again in person. This presentation will be made available, and here at the end you'll find a long list of recent research and journal articles referenced within the presentation, and they are all currently freely available to read or download online. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a lovely sunny evening. Thank you.